Take a look at a map of the world, and you are essentially looking at a map of debt. Every single nation on this planet is operating in the red. The United States currently shoulders a staggering burden of over $38 trillion, the highest numerical figure in its entire existence. The European Union is carrying a load of roughly $14 trillion. Japan's dealing with nearly $9 trillion. Even the nations we think of as incredibly wealthy oil giants like Saudi Arabia or manufacturing titans like Germany and China are all deep in the hole, owing truly enormous sums of capital. But this situation presents a fascinating logical paradox. If every single country owes money, who exactly are they owing it to? Who is on the other side of the ledger? Welcome to Histocoin, the place where financial history, economic power, and the mysteries of money collide. As we are about to discover, nothing in the world of finance is ever as simple as the numbers suggest. You see, debt is not merely a financial burden or a sign of bad bookkeeping. It is the very architecture of our modern civilization. Every war that has been fought, every economic crisis we have weathered, and every boom and bust cycle we have experienced sits precariously on top of this invisible scaffolding of IOUs. And if you have the patience to follow the chain of creditors back far enough, you uncover a reality that is somewhat unsettling. The world doesn't really owe this money to aliens or some secret cabal. Fundamentally, the world owes it to itself. However, do not mistake that for equality. Just because we owe it to ourselves does not mean everyone benefits from the arrangement equally. To truly understand how we arrived at this precarious moment, a planet drowning in over $315 trillion of total global debt, a figure nearly 3 times the size of the entire global economy, we have to rewind the clock. We need to go back to the genesis of this system. Centuries before the concept of a credit card swipe or an instant digital transfer existed, the idea of national debt was born. And it wasn't invented in a banking hall or on Wall Street. It was born in the mud and blood of war. The year was 1694. England was locked in a brutal conflict with France, and the king was running desperately low on gold. With the treasury empty, the king turned to a group of merchants for a lifeline. They struck a deal that would change history. In exchange for a permanent stream of interest payments funded by future taxation, the merchants would finance the crown's war efforts. To manage this sophisticated new arrangement, a new institution was founded, the Bank of England. This moment was revolutionary. Suddenly, the state had the magical ability to spend money that it did not physically possess. In return, the lenders received something invaluable, a promise from the government. But this wasn't just a handshake. It was a promise that could be traded, bought, and sold to others. This was the birth of the government bond, the seed from which our entire modern financial system has grown. The idea was so potent that it spread like wildfire. France copied the model. The Netherlands refined it into an art form. Later, the newly independent United States adopted it to fund its revolution and finance its expansion across the continent. National debt transformed from a mark of failure into a measure of credibility. In this new world, the ability to borrow huge sums was synonymous with the ability to rule. Where empires once conquered territory to extract physical gold, they now issued bonds to extract interest. The battlefield had officially become the balance sheet. Fast forward 300 years to the present day, and debt has become the world's most dominant export product. As mentioned, the United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes over $9 trillion. Global borrowing is currently increasing by the equivalent of $1 trillion every single 100 days. Every nation owes. Every bank lends. And every citizen, through their tax obligations, their savings accounts, and their pension funds, is simultaneously a debtor and a creditor. But let's solve the mystery. Who is holding the other end of the rope? Let's focus on the United States, as its debt is the anchor of the global system. Of that massive $38 trillion pile, about half is publicly held, which means it is owed to investors rather than just shuffled between different government departments. But here's the surprise. Roughly 2/3 of those investors are American entities. We are talking about U.S. banks, American pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve itself. The remaining 1/3, which amounts to about $9 trillion, sits in foreign hands. Japan is currently the top foreign holder with around $1 trillion, followed by China with about $800 billion. Then comes the UK, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So, when you hear people panic that the US is owned by China, the reality is far less dramatic. That is true for only about 2% of the total debt. The vast majority of the debt America owes is actually owed to America. It functions like a closed loop. The U.S. Treasury issues bonds to raise cash. Banks and funds buy them. The Federal Reserve often buys them back, creating new dollars in the process to grease the wheels. American citizens pay taxes, which fund the interest payments on those bonds, and those interest payments flow back into American retirement accounts and pension funds. It is a circular mirror. The debt is real, but the creditor is mostly a reflection of the same system. And this circularity isn't limited to the United States, it is global. Japan lends to the US by buying treasuries. The US lends to Europe through institutions like the IMF. Europe lends to developing nations via the World Bank. And those developing nations, in turn, lend back to advanced economies by parking their foreign exchange reserves in Western government bonds. It is a planetary game of hot potato, except the potato is made of financial promises. Every country holds someone else's IOU. Every promise is secured by another promise. It is like a high-stakes poker table where every single player is betting with chips they borrowed from the person sitting next to them, and the only rule keeping the game alive is that nobody is allowed to stand up and cash out. However, there is a fourth layer to this, perhaps the most powerful of all, the markets themselves. Behind every boring government bond sits a complex web of institutions, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks managing tens of trillions in assets. These entities are the true judges of credit. They are the ones who decide which nations get to borrow cheaply and which ones must pay a premium just to survive. When these markets lose confidence, we see currencies collapse, governments topple, and entire economies forced to restructure overnight. We like to think democracy decides who governs, but in reality, the bond market decides who survives. The high priest of this modern system is the central bank. Central banks don't merely manage the debt, they essentially manufacture it. Every time the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank purchases government bonds, they create new money from thin air to make the purchase. The liability on one balance sheet magically becomes the asset on another. Every dollar or euro in circulation essentially represents a unit of debt somewhere else in the chain. In our current system, there is no such thing as debt-free money. Every coin, every bill, and every digital number in your bank account has an invisible IOU engraved on its surface. For decades, this loop has sustained itself through one thing: confidence. As long as investors believe that governments will continue to pay the interest even if they never pay back the original principal, the machine keeps turning. But what happens when that confidence wavers? We have seen the previews. In Greece in 2010, the markets decided the government's debt was unpayable. Bondholders panicked. Interest rates spiked. The European Central Bank and the IMF had to intervene. But their rescue came with a heavy price tag: austerity. We saw tax hikes, brutal spending cuts, and mass unemployment. For an entire generation of Greeks, bailout became a synonym for sacrifice. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned sovereign debt into a recurring national curse. In Sri Lanka, the government ran out of foreign currency to service its loans, leading to fuel shortages and political collapse. When the system breaks, the invisible creditors suddenly become very visible. The IMF, the credit rating agencies, the anonymous bondholders, they suddenly appear to hold entire nations by the throat. And yet, even after collapse, the same logic eventually restarts. New loans are issued to replace the old ones. Old debts are restructured. The machine resets with a new name on the same balance sheet. This happens because, in the 21st century, sovereign debt is not designed to be repaid. It is designed to be rolled over. Governments today do not actually plan to clear their debts to zero. Not now, and likely not ever. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It is standard economic policy. When you or I take out a mortgage or a car loan, we are expected to pay back the principal. But governments operate by different physics. They treat debt like a rolling subscription service. They issue new bonds to pay off the old ones as they mature, a process economists call refinancing. In this model, interest becomes the real product. It is the rent charged for stability. The global economy now depends on that rent, like a shark that must keep swimming forward to breathe. The global financial system runs on confidence, not repayment. The United States will never simply pay off its $38 trillion debt. It will refinance it forever. Japan has been rolling over its debt for decades, with a debt load exceeding 250% of its GDP, yet its borrowing costs remain near zero. Why do investors tolerate this? Because they aren't waiting to be repaid. They are waiting to renew the deal. For them, government debt is the safest form of collateral in existence. A U.S. Treasury bond isn't viewed as a liability. It is viewed as a pristine asset, the bedrock foundation of global markets. Pension funds must hold them. Banks use them as security for trading. Central banks treat them as cash equivalents. Here is the irony. The system actually depends on governments never paying off their debt. If they did, the world would lose its most trusted financial instrument. Imagine if Washington somehow decided to pay down every last dollar of its debt tomorrow. Banks and funds around the world would suddenly lose their most stable asset. The supply of US dollars would shrink dramatically, triggering massive deflation and a market collapse. Paying off the debt would destroy the very mechanism that makes the modern economy function. So, governments do the opposite. They keep issuing more debt, not necessarily out of recklessness, but out of rhythm. The debt becomes a kind of heartbeat for capitalism itself, pulsing through every pension plan, mortgage, and stock market on Earth. This is why, when politicians get on stage and talk about balancing the budget or paying down the national debt, they are selling you a fantasy. The goal of a modern state isn't to eliminate debt. The goal is to keep it sustainable, serviceable, and desirable enough that the system never stops believing in its value. Because once that belief fades, the math stops working. Confidence collapses, interest rates spike, and an economy built entirely on rolling promises grinds to a halt. That is the real secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to pay it back. The plan is to keep the world believing that they could if they wanted to. It is a closed loop of trust. And as long as that trust holds, the numbers on the screen can stretch upward indefinitely. But we must remember that trust is not evenly distributed. When we say we owe it to ourselves, that is only a half-truth. Interest payments do not flow equally through society. They flow upward, moving from the taxpayers and workers who fund the government to the institutions and wealthy investors who hold the debt bonds. In other words, debt isn't just a transfer of wealth between countries, it is a transfer between classes. That is why global inequality and global indebtedness tend to rise together. The system rewards those who own the debt and punishes those who merely pay for it. If that dynamic sounds familiar, it is because it is the same story we see everywhere, just scaled up, from households to nations and from nations to the planet. Creditors aren't necessarily villains, and debtors aren't always victims. They are two sides of the same internal combustion engine. The problem arises when the engine runs out of fuel, when new borrowing can't keep pace with the promises made in the past. That is the moment when the question, who is the creditor, stops being an abstract economic concept and starts being personal. Because at the top of this global pyramid, there isn't one single face to blame. It isn't just China. It isn't just Wall Street. It isn't just the IMF. It is all of them, and in a way, it is all of us. The modern financial system has turned debt itself into money. Governments issue it, banks multiply it, investors trade it, and citizens depend on it for their currency to have value. The line between debtor and creditor has blurred beyond recognition. Debt once meant bondage. Today, it is sold to us as balance. But if that balance ever tips, if the confidence finally breaks, the illusion will end, and we will be forced to remember what debt really is, a promise that cannot be kept forever. If this deep dive gave you a new perspective on the money in your pocket, hit subscribe to Histocoin. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.